If If you have not yet joined one of our Bridge Book Club events, you may not know me. My name is Amber Dilland, and I'm the Membership and Engagement Director for Bridge, Michigan. Today we are discussing The Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls by Anissa Gray, and this event is hosted by Bridge, Michigan. I also am joined today on this call by my colleague, Catherine Dougal, who is the Development and Engagement Specialist at the Center for Michigan, and Josiah Foster, who is the Fund Development Associate at the Center for Michigan, and they'll each play a role in today's conversation. We are also very fortunate to be joined by author Anissa Gray today, who I will be introducing very shortly. If you are not super familiar with Bridge, Michigan, I'd love to tell you a little bit about us. We are Michigan's nonprofit, nonpartisan news source, covering issues that matter to you and to your community. You can subscribe for free to Bridge if you don't already. We have several email newsletters for you to choose from. You can visit www.bridgemi.com to subscribe to Bridge. Also, those who are current Bridge Club members, who are people who have donated any amount to Bridge over the last year, get a number of benefits, including access to a free ebook copy of each of our Bridge Book Club selections, including Care and Feeding. You can become a member today by visiting a link that we'll drop in the chat. As I mentioned, today we are so lucky to be joined by author Anissa Gray. I will be introducing her formally in just one moment, but we are just so incredibly honored that you are willing to join us today, Anissa. And I think this is going to be a fantastic discussion of your excellent novel. Let's see here. I'm sorry, I lost my place in my introduction. So our schedule today is I'm going to lead a discussion with Anissa about the book for about 40 minutes. And then we'll take your questions. So readers, if you have questions about the book for our special guest, you can drop those into the chat at any time. And in the last 15 minutes or so, we'll turn to those questions that you have. And then we will conclude by 1 p.m. at the latest. I want to make sure that we value all of your time. As you heard earlier, we are recording this discussion, and we'll be posting that recording in Bridge on later this week, hopefully this afternoon, or at the very latest tomorrow. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest. Anissa Gray is a journalist at CNN Worldwide and a contributor to Emmy and DuPont Columbia award-winning coverage of some of the most consequential stories of our time. She began her career at Reuters as a reporter based in New York, covering business, news, and international finance. Born in St. Joseph, Michigan, Gray studied English and American literature at New York University. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia with her wife. The Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls, which was released in 2019, is her first novel. Anissa, thanks so much and welcome.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
We are delighted. My very first question for you is, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you chose to write Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls?
Absolutely. As you said, I've been a journalist. I am a journalist. I've been a journalist for my entire professional career. 30 plus years. But growing up, I was a kid who I enjoyed reading and writing stories. And I'd always thought about becoming a novelist. So at one point in my journalism career, I guess that was about maybe 10 years ago or so, I got pretty burned out. And I went back to that childhood dream of being a novelist. So I sat down and I got to work on it. And as I wrote Care and Feeding. I've been pretty surprised, and I feel incredibly fortunate with the way the book has been received. So, I thank you all for reading it, for taking the time to read it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. As you mentioned, this is your debut novel. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of, what the experience as a novelist has been so far?
I think for me, sort of, as I said, it was a childhood dream. And here as an adult, having realized that dream, I have to tell you, it's been an incredible experience. I'm more of an executive in my journalism career, which means I'm not out covering stories. So as a novelist, it's been just incredible to, back when, before COVID, when we were actually doing, live book event, to be out there and at events like this now, Zoom events where I can talk to people all over the country, it's been just an incredible experience, just being able to talk to people, fellow readers, about books, and in particular about some of the issues raised in care and feeding. I can tell you it's the most enjoyable part of the experience of having written a novel, connecting with other readers and events like this.
Fantastic. Thank you. You touched on this in sort of your opening answer, but I'm just curious about, how your experience as a novelist compares to your experience as a journalist. How these two aspects of your career influence one another.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, as I said, I've been a journalist for 30 years or so, and journalism and novel writing definitely share some things in common. There's sort of the basic storytelling, choosing how you're going to go about telling that story, so the structure of the story. But they're very different in the approach, because with journalism, you're telling someone else's story. With novel writing, of course, you just get to make stuff up, which is wonderful. The only facts you're working with are, whatever sort of historical or geographical or event-specific constraints, factual constraints you may have. Otherwise, it's a world you create, which is a lot of fun. I will say one of the things I do bring over from being a journalist to being a novelist is work ethic. As a novelist, I view writing as work, just as I do with journalism. That's very helpful for me in focusing on deadlines and dealing with edits and different editors, people who are weighing in on your work and asking you to make changes. So a few things that would make the experience similar, but there's quite a lot that makes it different. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really I find it really interesting to hear sort of about process. And as you know, these are all readers of a news publication, but we all sort of come together because we appreciate reading all sorts of things. And so just hearing those two sides of the way that you work is really helpful to me, and I think to a lot of us. That was one of the questions we saw from readers ahead of time.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's people ask me that a lot, and I think it's a great question.
Thank you. And thank you for explaining sort of the two sides of the work that you do.
Sure.
Are there any aspects of care and feeding that were based on real life events or experiences?
There definitely are. When I sat down to write Care and Feeding, I was actually interested in writing a book about a woman in recovery from an eating disorder. I dealt with an eating disorder personally since college, and I didn't get proper treatment until I was in my 40s. But the story I was writing, focusing solely on the eating disorder, it just wasn't coming together. So over a period of time, I worked with the narrative quite a bit and broadened it out, as you guys see, having read it, to include other characters and issues. But the character with the eating disorder, Viola, is still at the center of the story. And a lot of her experiences are drawn from some of my own experiences in recovery. So there was a pretty strong personal connection to that for me.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, the novel, and for telling us a little bit about sort of your connection to it.
Sure, absolutely.
As you know, we're all in Michigan here, or at least many of us are. Was it important to you that the book was set in Southwest Michigan, and why did you choose for that to be the setting?
So the book is set in a fictionalized version of the town I grew up in, which is Muskegon, which is located, Western Michigan on Lake Michigan. Sort of broadly speaking, I think it's a story that could have taken place anywhere. For instance, I live in Atlanta, and very briefly, I thought about setting the book here. But when I sat down to write it, because I was dealing with family and some personal issues that were important to me, I thought it was important to set the book in an area of the country I knew very well. While I've lived in Atlanta at this point much longer than I lived in Michigan, I don't feel like a Southerner. I don't identify as a Southerner. I'll consider myself a Midwesterner, until the end, I think. So with those issues, top of mind, I thought it was important to set the book in a part of the country where I was familiar with. I was also talking a lot about their childhood experiences, and it was really helpful for me to draw on what it was like being a kid in Michigan with snow, as we were talking about, and all of that came along with it. So the atmospherics were as important to me as my sort of personal connection and my emotional connection with Michigan and the Midwest.
I think I can say for me, and it's something that I heard from a lot of the readers in this group on our Facebook group, is that it made it feel very real. Like it was a very sort of lived in experience. Just the way it was obviously a familiar setting as I was reading it. And for me, that was one of the things that really drew me in as a reader.
Yeah, I think it's also sort of a part of the country and a group of people, working class people, that we don't, in my opinion, see enough of. We don't get enough of those stories, in my opinion. So that was another reason it was important for me to set the book in a place among, people, salt of the earth type people who sometimes run into trouble, working class folks that you get to hear their stories very often.
Absolutely. Just a reminder for those who aren't speaking, if you could just make sure that you mute yourself. My next question for you is one that's a little heavier. Trauma really impacts the actions of nearly every character in this book. Was this aspect of the story difficult to write? And how were you sort of able to map each character's arc through that trauma?
Yes, it's another good question. At the heart of the book, there's an exploration of generational trauma. For instance, how a parent can pass traumatic issues down to their kids. As a writer, approaching trauma of any kind can be a little, to greater or lesser degrees, emotionally draining. In this case in particular, I was writing about some things that were close to the bone, specifically Viola's eating disorder. Fortunately, for me, I was far enough away from treatment myself to be able to look at it from the distance of experience. So in that way, it was much easier to write about that experience. But it was a challenge for sure, because I had to mine some of my own memories and my own journey. And in dealing with some of the other characters who had traumatic events that were different from my own personal experiences, I sort of applied that same sense of empathy to their journey as well. So I hope that came across in the creation of the characters and in the storytelling.
I would say my own experience as a reader, it certainly did. And thank you for sharing that with us. One of my other questions I had as I was reading is, I was like, man, this is just such a story that I feel like I can see it. Like I felt like I got to know the characters. So I went down a little rabbit hole and I was searching to see, like, is this going to be adapted in any way? And I did read that it had been optioned by Gabrielle Union for an adaptation. Congrats, first of all.
Thank you.
You probably can't, but is there anything you can tell us about it?
Well, I don't know a ton. You're right, it has been optioned. The last time I spoke to them, they had a script writer, and they were moving forward. But that it's been several months, and these things, one moment they're in the works and on the way, and the next moment they just don't happen. So we'll see. They have a few more months on the option, and we'll see what they pull together, if anything.
Well, I know we all have our fingers crossed. I'd love to, if you hear anything, we'd love to give an update to our readers. So I
will ping you for sure.
Fantastic. I appreciate it. I was I thought a lot about sort of the titles of the sections in the book. That obviously there's references to care and feeding, but there's a lot of water symbolism throughout the book. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and kind of what it meant to you?
With the sort of, I think for me, it was sort of this overall metaphor of nourishment. When you're in treatment for an eating disorder, one of the things they tell you is that it's not about the food. There's this sort of attempt to fill those hollow spaces. And I think that was the case for all of the characters in the story. For Viola, of course, it was the literal eating disorder. For Althea, it was having lost her mother and never quite finding her way since she was a kid. So there was a real sense of loss and an emptiness on her part. For Lillian as well, also lost her mother, had endured abuse, also those hollow places. So you have these people who are trying to fill themselves up to make a different life. And when I thought about sort of that overall metaphor of nourishment, it's sort of what we're all looking for. And yes, it's food and water, but sometimes it's love, sometimes it's care, sometimes it's someone listening to you, sometimes it's finding your way out of trauma. So that's what that sort of overall metaphor of nourishment meant to me.
Absolutely. I was curious as I was reading it, just as I've often heard from readers that people are just very interested in sort of the process of writing, just because it's, for many of us are not novelists. Myself, I can definitely speak for myself there. As I was sort of seeing the arc of the story and sort of the way that it all of these parts of their lives come through in the past, did you always know, for example, that Kim was going to disappear, or did that develop as you were writing?
Yeah, it developed as I was writing. Just the little process backstory for this book. This whole book was sort of an evolution. As I said earlier, I started out with a really sort of narrow focus, and that was just on Viola's character. And it was just going to be about her life, working as a therapist in an eating disorder and having to deal with her own relapse and recovery. But, it was just too narrow. So one of the things I did was I sort of stepped back and I looked at her biography. Now, every writer's different, but for me, I make a complete backstory and biography for a character. And a lot of that may not make it onto the page, but it informs the writing and sort of the facts of how I understand this person. I wasn't going to include her sisters at all, really, not in any meaningful way. But in looking at their backstories, I felt like there was something there, and it worked very much with that metaphor of nourishment and emptiness. So they were included. They were included as well. And so for me, it was, I started out with a nugget of an idea, and then it evolved to include those characters. And then once I had those characters over several drafts, it came to me what happened to them. So I'm not a writer who writes to outline. I don't know every single thing that's going to happen. I have a general idea, particularly after I reach a certain point in, having done a draft or two, I get a general idea, but characters surprise me. Some of their actions surprise me. And in this case, Kim's disappearance came as a surprise, but it worked.
That is so fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I love the idea of sort of mapping out each character's full story, whether or not all of that ends up on the page. That's really cool. We got a really great question in the chat, but I'm not going to save it for the end. I'm just going to throw it right in here. Mary wanted to know, she said that the prison scenes were very interesting and dramatic for her, especially just not knowing a lot about this setting. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of writing these scenes that were set in the prison?
About writing the prison scenes. Yeah. I watched a lot of prison documentaries. Growing up, my dad was a preacher and he did work at a prison ministry. So I had a little bit of experience there. So And I've also known people, as a preacher's kid, my dad's church was open to everyone. You had, middle-class families there, but you also had a lot of people who were also on the margins. So I, I was able to get to know a lot of different stories. So, or just, growing up, kids in my communities, their parents and things like that. So some of the characters in the prison are drawn from people I've known. So, that brought a real level of authenticity to it. The actual physical space was sort of pulled together from facts of what I knew of prisons and imagination.
Fantastic. Thank you. And speaking of some of the characters that we meet in the prison setting, I thought Mercedes' character was so interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about writing her and sort of, when you were writing her, what the message is that you hoped that we would all learn from her?
Well, sort of, again, having, sort of my first experience with prison was through ministry. My dad's ministry was, I've always sort of thought in terms of redemption. Mercedes, she had a particularly hard life. There were circumstances that led to where she was. So when Mercedes, and again, Mercedes is drawn from a few people I knew, who were addicted to drugs and just really found themselves spiraling. But for her, prison turned out to be a redemptive process. It sort of stopped her in the middle of her decline, and she was able to make some different choices. Now, for her, she ran the prison Bible study. That was her way out. For others, it may be something different. But that was her change moment. And I was also in the book just broadly interested in relationships and friendships between people who are very different. There's the relationship between Lillian and Nai. There's the relationship between Viola and David. And in the prison, there's this relationship between Althea and Mercedes. So I was also interested in exploring that as well.
I really enjoyed that. One of the questions that I posed to our discussion group on Facebook was about friendship. Obviously a lot of the book is about family, but about sort of friendships being being a stabilizing force when things are scary and chaotic. Was that an important part of the book as you were formulating it?
Yeah, it was extremely important, and it's and it's interesting that you bring up family. It's this idea of chosen family, and I think for Althea and Mercedes, through their experience together, there was an opportunity. They chose each other, and even when Althea went, I'm assuming everyone's read the book and everything. So even when Althea, went on to serve her sentence, Mercedes landed with members of her family. So there was a place for her. And, I'm always sort of interested in exploring those sort of, moments of redemption and finding oneself and connections through friendships, families, or both.
Absolutely. Those were some of my favorite moments as a reader. One of the things that I have enjoyed, I'm a big reader myself, and that I have really enjoyed the book reviews that you've written for the Washington Post.
Thank you.
Absolutely. They're fantastic. I'd love to know, are there books that you've read recently that you enjoyed or found inspiring that this group might take a look at?
I've been working on a second novel, and when I'm writing, it's difficult for me to read because it's just, I feel like I have too much in my head. But I just finished my latest draft and sent that off to my editor, so I'm free to read now. And the book series I have on my table that I'm ready to dive into over the holidays is Margaret Atwood's Mad Adams series. It's very much on the dystopian side, so it's not light reading, but that's what's next up on my agenda.
Oh, very cool. Well, I think, yeah, not at one of the lighter ones, but I really enjoyed that series. So
Yeah.
I think you will as well if you have not read that one in the past. Thanks for that.
Mhm.
Speaking of your next novel, I'm sure there's not much you can tell us, but I know I personally am thrilled to hear that you're writing another. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of what you've been working on, either with that novel or in your journalistic career? We'd just love to know.
Well, I can talk about the novel sort of broadly. It's about it's set in Detroit, which for me, took a lot of research because I'm not from that part of Michigan. But that was really an interesting aspect of writing it. But it's about a family, what happens to a family after the father disappears, and of course, what happens to the father and what happens to him. So that's broadly what the book is about. And if things go as planned, it's scheduled for release in spring of 2023, which will be here before you know it. I don't know about you guys, but it's like time has just been like, I look up like, what? It's been a year? What? I've been in my house for a year? So that time has really been flying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you. I know, I'm sure Bridge Book Club members are penciling that into their calendars right now. I know I am. So looking
Well,
forward
thank you
to
guys.
it.
Thank you guys. So fingers crossed, every editing process goes great.
Absolutely. I see a couple of questions from our readers in the chat, so I'll bring in some of those. Judith wanted to know, and it sounds like this could have been the case with your dad having been a minister growing up. She said the Bible group is like a women's circle. Do you have any experience with a women's circle?
Yeah, I do. Just having grown up in the church, and for me, it was literally growing up in the church. A lot of my social, most of my social connections, in addition to the spiritual connections, were in church with youth group, and as I grew older, women's groups and things like that. So a lot of that was drawn from that. In fact, I was thinking specifically of a group my mom used to be in, and it was called the Sewing Circle. And these are all women who sewed. This was in the 70s and 80s, back when my mom used to make most of our clothes. And they would just have it was spiritually based, but they had a great time together and just sharing, helping each other through life.
Absolutely. And you could tell that felt like those scenes felt very authentic to me. So it also sounded familiar. So Bob was involved in many, many similar things. So Pat wanted to know, how do you determine the names of your characters? Are your characters' names important?
Names are super important, and I pay a lot of attention to names. I tend to like older names for a lot of my characters. Viola. In my latest book, I have a character named Azro. So yeah, names are hugely important.
Excellent, excellent. Just a reminder to those who are not participating, if you could mute yourself, I'd really appreciate that. If our readers have any additional questions as we've been typing, please feel free to throw them into the chat if you have them. One of the scenes that I found most impactful as I was reading was sort of the Thanksgiving meeting between Althea and Proctor. And it just felt like, this is this moment of honesty that had scenes like it taken place earlier, that, the whole story might be very different. Can you tell us a little bit about writing that scene?
Yeah, and a lot of that is sort of very much tied to Althea and her sort of insular way. I will tell you, she was the most difficult character for me to write. She was the most difficult character for me to access because she's so different from how I am. But yeah, I think you're right. If she'd been able to access those sort of hidden emotions that are hidden for her, and if she were able to express herself through words rather than acting out in sort of a negative fashion, you're right, the story would have gone quite differently. But I think that's the case for all of us. It often takes, for her, it took a very extreme situation. But it often takes, certainly for me, something being put in my face and saying, hey, what's the deal? And I think that was, in a sort of a nutshell, the case for her, but in a very sort of dramatic way.
Very cool. Excellent. Really the last question that I have for you today, as in my mind's eye of what happens to these characters after I was reading, I felt like things ended on a hopeful note, sort of a redemptive note. Is that how you felt about it? It's not like things were tied up neatly with a bow. Althea still served her sentence, but is that sort of where your mind went for these characters at the end of the story of what we know about them?
Yeah, it was for sure. I'm not a huge fan of the super tidy ending, because I want it to be somewhat reflective of life. But to your point, I wanted it to be hopeful, because I did feel like all of these characters, even with Althea heading to jail, that was the price she had to pay. But she was going into it, I think, emotionally stronger, and in a better place. I think, all of the characters had gotten to a much better place, and they were headed off in their own directions. And, I wish very good things for them. But yeah, my goal was to end someplace hopeful, if not completely tied up with a bow.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to say that it was a true pleasure to read, and we're
Thank you so much.
honored that you wrote it and that you join us. It looks like we do have one more question from a reader. They wanted to know if you can talk a little bit about the crime and how it changes the family, sort of the way of the impact of what the actual events that put Proctor and Althea in that situation.
Yes, that's a great question. I'll tell you where I got the idea for that. My dad had in his congregation a couple, and their crime was, more minor than what happened here, but it was food stamp fraud, and their sentence much lower because they didn't, tack on the rest of the stuff. And one of the things the judge decided to do in this case was have the dad serve his sentence, and then he'd come home, and then he delayed the mom's sentence, and she would serve it later, so that there was always going to be somebody home with the kids. And I was thinking about what would it do to a family to have both parents just torn away at the same time, and not just for a short period, but over a long period of time. And particularly for these girls, it's graduation, it's going off to college, it's prom, it's, to miss those real life milestones. What would that do to a family? And particularly in this case, a family that already had a ton of baggage. So I just thought that was fertile ground for exploration. And, generally speaking, it's difficult for children. I wrote a piece actually in conjunction with the release of the book, and it was a journalistic piece about children who have parents who are in the penal system, and sort of what it does to them. And as you can imagine, it's traumatic, and it's difficult. So, I don't know what the answers are, but I worked with a group, and their job was to give these families, like the caregivers of these children and the children, sort of free rides to prison to see their parents, so that there's at least that ongoing parental connection, which has been found to be helpful to children.
Absolutely. Beth asked, can you talk a little bit about why you included Kim's attempted suicide and subsequent rescue in the book?
I think because, for two reasons. Kim was a really impulsive kid. It was on impulse that she reported her parents. And I think also there's something at that age, this sort of fatalistic sense of life when things are just completely out of your control. And I think that felt to me like a very real reaction a teenager in her shoes might have had. So that was the reason it sort of went there with her. She was a particularly, her twin sister dealt with it in a different way, very internally, and she was sort of moving into an eating disorder. Kim was a much more explosive kid, and that was the internal expression, I think, for her to the trauma she was enduring.
Thank you so
Mhm.
much. This has been such a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Josiah to close us out for the afternoon.
All right. Thank you, guys. I want to thank you all so much. I want to thank you to Anissa Gray, and thank you to Amber and Catherine, my colleagues, for helping moderate this. I want you to keep in mind that about around this time next week, you should see a recording of this video. So if you want to share that with friends, we highly encourage you to do that. Our next book talk will be in February. So in January, just look out for a post of our next book to see what we will talk about. I'm so excited to see what happens next. So guys, I'll see you later. And I hope everyone had a good time here. And thank you so much for joining us this hour.